Next, we welcome a panel to discuss how political correctness and fake news impact their work. We welcome back Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, as our moderator. Panelists for this session include Nancy Gibbs, Liza Donnelly, Louise Fabregas, and Tony Norman. Would you please step to the stage? Nancy Gibbs is the Edward R. Murrow Visiting Professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and served for many years as a fact-checker, award-winning writer, and ultimately editor-in-chief of Time magazine. A renowned writer, her book, The President's Club, received numerous awards. Mrs. Gibbs is co-chair of the Center on Communication, Leadership, and Policy at the University of Southern California, Annenberg, president of the American Friends of New College, Oxford, and a trustee of the Chautauqua Institution. Liza Donnelly is a writer and award-winning cartoonist for The New Yorker and resident cartoonist for CBS News. She also writes and draws for the New York Times and CNN. As a cultural envoy for the United States Department of State, Ms. Donnelly has spoken around the world about freedom of speech, including the role of cartoons and women's rights. Louise Fabregas is editor of the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review's digital Pittsburgh edition and the Valley News Dispatch, a daily newspaper based in nearby Tarentum. A graduate of Duquesne University, he previously served as medical editor and deputy managing editor at the Tribune-Review. Tony Norman is an award-winning columnist for the Post-Gazette, where he is also the paper's book review editor and has served on the editorial board. He is also an adjunct professor of journalism at Chatham University. Among other distinctions, Mr. Norman has won Keystone, Golden Quill, and Pittsburgh Black Media Federation awards.
Thank you so much. Fake news, political correctness, and the editorial function. What a subject, and I think that our mission is to identify the question of whether students and citizens are self-censoring and whether they are isolating themselves into filter bubbles and echo chambers, and what, if anything, the media organizations all of you work for can do about it. Nancy, you're teaching at Harvard now. You see the way the students are having discussions. Are they self-censoring and engaging in polarized behavior, and why would that be?
The self-censoring is a concern to any of us who are educators or who are parents, or even in our own conversations about whether we feel that the richness and the learning that comes from a serious engagement with ideas is being somehow diluted or limited because of people's caution about offending someone. I actually think that being cautious about offending people is a good thing. Calling it political correctness already sort of stacks the deck that this is a negative, and obviously during the campaign it was much cited as this very negative trend. You can also look at it as a sensitivity and an instinct to courtesy and an awareness that people are going to bring different experiences and points of view to the conversation. Having said that, you hope that conversations, whether it's between students or with faculty or the people that you encounter in the coffee shop or the pickup line, are willing to really engage with ideas without having to hold back and run everything that they want to say through a filter that prevents them from learning from each other. And so I do think that we're trying to walk a line that has respect as a foundation and courtesy and civility as a foundation of our conversations with each other. And yet there's a fearlessness and a creativity and an energy with which we are looking to learn from each other and provoke each other and stimulate each other and invite each other to think in new ways. And that, I think, is the tension that we are all experiencing in different ways.
That is a great way to put it. The balance between the need for civility and respect for different points of view and a willingness to listen to them is one of our central challenges. Liza, you're a great cartoonist. To celebrate the First Amendment, you wrote this really inspiring cartoon of the Statue of Liberty, as well as of the First Amendment as a pair of wings, which was just so beautiful. Cartoons have inspired terrorism and death, as we know from Charlie Hebdo and from the response to blasphemy. And yet, your cartoons and the cartoons in the New Yorker seem to engage in satire and civility at the same time. So how do you see your function as a cartoonist in addressing the line that Nancy identified?
Well, I agree with Nancy that we have the First Amendment and we should be able to say or draw whatever we want in this country. But as journalists, or as opinion journalists, which is what I consider myself to be, we have a responsibility to be careful as to what we might perceive might happen if we drew something a certain way. That said, my colleagues I support them wholeheartedly to draw what they want. My job as a cartoonist is not only to make people smile, but also I'm an individual that I try to make people. I feel like I'm a catalyst or I can't think of the word, something to a spark plug to make people think. So a lot of my cartoons, not only are in the New Yorker, but I publish on Medium, and I publish my political cartoons there primarily. And I share them on Twitter and on Instagram all the time. So my stuff is what's known as a thumb stopper. So people are scrolling through and they'll stop and they'll see this colorful, bold drawing and they'll stop and look at it. So my hope is that I'm able to cross boundaries, go across these pockets of people that are thinking alike. Maybe I can speak to other people. And my stuff is kind of quiet for a cartoonist. I'm not the kind of cartoonist that hits people over the head with my thoughts. So I invite them in to think about what I'm thinking or what I'm seeing and have a dialogue. Cartoons are dialogue in my eyes.
That's a really powerful idea, and there's something about a whimsical cartoon that can appeal to both sides and inspire dialogue and opinion in a way that's less polarizing than the Twitter sphere. Louise, you wrote a really moving column where you said this is the last print edition of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, but we're now going Tribune. No one will notice the difference here, so it's not important.
Of course
I know,
not.
exactly. They're the same thing, so absolutely. Details. The Tribune, last edition, you're now presiding over this flourishing digital version of it. What's the difference between the digital and print version in the way people react and all the stuff we've been talking about in terms of polarization, anonymous comment, and do your reporters write differently for one than for the other?
So let me tell you something really fascinating, that when I went to school here at Duquesne, my major was print journalism. And here I am directing a digital operation, which is really sort of, it's very fascinating. But I think, I see our jobs as guardians of truth and as guardians of credibility. And regardless of what your platform is, whether it's print or digital, that's always something that I have to keep in mind when I'm talking to reporters and editors at the same time. I mean, so we have this responsibility to make sure that people get facts, right? And I think in this day and age, we can all agree that that's been sort of like a daily struggle for news organizations, because the issue of fake news is whether or not we believe what we're reading or we don't believe it, or is it factual or is it not factual. So I don't really see a difference between the print world and the digital world. If anything, we have every day more of a struggle, because we are up against, as the Mr. Richard from Google was saying earlier, we have all these various different ways in which people are getting news now. It's not just the paper. When I used to, read the recipes and read the news that editors decided they were going to give me. Now the reader tends to be more selective and determined, hey, this is what I want to read. So I want to make sure every day that I'm giving facts and truth and real information.
Tony, you're an opinion columnist at a newspaper that famously has had some clashes between a new owner and a beloved cartoonist.
Well, actually, it's the same owner, but a new editorial director.
New editorial director.
Right.
So how has that affected your job? Do you still feel the independence to write what you think? And has the new media environment and the economics of it affected the way that you express yourself?
Well, I just don't have a relationship with the new editorial director, so I don't really feel the more conservative bent of the editorial page has any effect on me. I think the second that I'm asked to conform myself to a more, let's say, pro-Trump slant will probably be my last day there, because I just can't. I wouldn't have any integrity if I did that. So I think they respect me enough to let me just go in my own direction, even though it's contrary to the editorial direction of the publisher and maybe even the page. As for new media, I find that, I mean, I'm a heavy Twitter user, and I, navigate around Facebook and other platforms just to get this, my column out and so forth. And I like the interaction with the readers. So I consider myself a babe when it comes to these other platforms. I'm learning them. I'm learning what their limitations are and so forth. So I'm open to learning and growing and hopefully deepening my ability to speak with integrity using these different platforms.
Great. All right, let's try to propose solutions to these problems that we've been discussing so illuminatingly at the conference. So Richard Gingras did ask whether the internet had become a beacon of participation or a proliferator of venom that was dividing democracy. Nancy, you've identified the decline of traditional media intermediaries and decline in trust in those intermediaries as a big source of the problem. You presided over time at a time when it was trusted. And one of the solutions you've proposed is greater transparency and accountability so people know what's going on inside the newsroom. But tell us more about your proposals for how to resurrect trust and filtering in an age without intermediaries and filters.
I do think, and Marty Barron and Dean Baquet and David talked about transparency this morning. I don't think transparency is the solution to all problems, but I do think as a guild that journalists historically have been particularly allergic to. We love asking questions, we don't like answering them. It's remarkable in some ways how little research there is about, you can learn about the corporate dynamics of any number of industries and organizations. Much less of that is available about media institutions. We don't like letting people in to examine us. I think these are all maybe natural reflexes, and so transparency doesn't necessarily come easily to us, of revealing as much as we can about how we went about reporting a story, why we chose to grant anonymity to certain sources and not others. There are any number of questions that are much discussed within newsrooms, but that's a bit of a black box. And so to the extent that it's possible to let our audiences, our viewers, our readers, our social platform followers know what goes into tracking down a story, the amount of work that goes into it, and the standards by which we judge whether something is ready to be made public, I think would at least be a starting point. There's some really disturbing data about the trust decline. And again, it's across all institutions practically, but the media trust decline has been precipitous. And it includes some shocking numbers about the number of people who think that reporters at mainstream news organizations just make up stories, and make up stories about the president in particular. That's not a marginal 10% of people. It's north of 40% of people. And that to me speaks to just a failure on our part to really explain how we go about our jobs. And I think there's room there just to be much more transparent about how we make decisions.
Just a quick follow-up, not to get fancy, but the theorist Max Weber said that authority requires mystery. Is there a danger that transparency, personalizing reporters leads to Twitter attacks on their politics and less trust rather than more?
Well, I think you put your finger on a very important issue, which is as reporters, especially, there are no boundaries between, print reporters are on TV all the time, and digital reporters are also, everyone is operating on every platform, and so there are many more opportunities for people to get to know the face and the personality behind a byline. For women journalists in particular, this has subjected them to really astonishingly disturbing levels of abuse. Right. And I had women who left journalism from my newsroom because it wow. had become just a part of their professional experience that had become intolerable. And the research about this globally is very alarming. And even the men in my newsroom were surprised. The men were accustomed to being told they were an idiot. They were not accustomed to having people say, "I'm going to come to your home and kill your children."
Right. Right.
And so I think that is a very significant challenge for how we are going to get bright, talented, motivated, idealistic people, men and women, to come into the profession, similar to getting people to come into public life, into politics, when anonymous and venomous attackers on social media have such free reign.
Wow.
Right. I think Hugh Hewitt yesterday touched upon the anonymity of the internet being and personalizing, the politics of destruction on the internet, especially Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, and comments under columns and news stories is a way of delegitimizing what we do. And I never agree with Hugh Hewitt on many things, but I was pounding pounding the air yesterday because I thought that, we got to eliminate the idea of hiding behind anonymity. I think if my name, my byline is out there, I should expect that the person that is responding to me online has the integrity to use his or her name as well. I think that's the only way you're going to have any sort of discourse that has any authenticity. And quite frankly, I'm a big believer in just blocking. I don't give a crap about having an ongoing conversation with some person I don't know who's using a fake name. I don't think that's a legitimate conversation. I just block them, and maybe I'm doing it all wrong. It seems to me that people are really engaging with venomous critics. I just think, what are they to me? Nothing. And so,
if I may add
please do, and let me just to press the point. To what degree, Louisa, are you finding that reporters, fearing internet reactions, call them Twitter mobs, are self-censoring, either because they're afraid of the harassment that Nancy's talking about, or afraid that polarized mobs will come down on them if they deviate from the party line?
What I think is that the use of the anonymous sources that Nancy brought up, and I think you're touching upon that too, that's really sort of affected the credibility of news organizations. And I remember as a reporter, I used to tell my editors all the time, well, I have this great story, it's coming from, I have 2 anonymous sources, I can't name them, and I would push my editors. I really think it's a great story. Now as an editor, I look at the other side and I see how it could really affect us. And I remember the wise words from an editor who once told me, is that anonymous source going to, if you get sued for the story, is that anonymous source going to sit in a courtroom and testify on your behalf and defend your story? And I think that was an eye-opening statement for me to understand how crucial it is for us to make sure that when we're presenting information, we can back it up with who said what.
Oh, I wasn't talking about sources. I was just talking about commenters. I think anonymous sources are essential to what we do. Otherwise, you don't get, the Pentagon Papers. You don't get all of the big breaks that the big stories. of the last, 60, 70 years especially. But I think that there is a culture of anonymity in social media that is just corrosive and basically is leading to self-censorship on the part of a lot of people in the media. And I think that we brought this on ourselves by allowing that culture to thrive without really having standards that everyone had to meet, even if they were civilians.
Liza, when you choose cartoon topics, the New Yorker, before the internet, was an unchallenged authority and no one could react except orally. You go to a cocktail party and say, I saw the great cartoon. Now there can be a lot of commenters. Do you choose your topics and frame your cartoons in anticipation of the comments and reactions or not? No. And how do you formulate, that's great, okay, wonderful, good for the First Amendment. But tell us more how there's something really unique about the cartooning form as you express it, this sort of gentle satire which is pointed but not polarizing. Say more about it, what your aim is, and why it is that cartoons are able to do this in a way that print is
Yeah,
not.
it's hard. It's hard to explain the process. Like, I will pay attention to the news, of course, and be alert for what I want to do a drawing about. For my kind of work, I pretty much do drawings that are not attacking specific individuals necessarily in the government or in the culture, but talk about cultural issues or talk about political issues or bigger, broader things that I see going on in the culture. And sometimes that means I may be really angry about something that happened in the government or in our politics, but I may not draw about it because I can't find an angle that I see as a bigger picture idea to draw about. That's my work. And I had the luxury of not having to produce for an editor on a daily basis. I don't, like many staff cartoonists, they have to come up with something every day, or at least 3 times a week. I do it when I feel moved to draw a cartoon, so I'm lucky that way. And the New Yorker doesn't, the way it works with the New Yorker, people are curious about this, I'll just be quick. We all submit a certain number of cartoons every week, and they either buy one or they don't. So that's their process. It's been that way for almost 100 years.
Nancy, more solutions. Let's really dig in. So trust, anonymity is a double-edged sword, as we've just been discussing. What are other ways of rebuilding trust now that the intermediaries are gone? Richard Gingras said Google has an initiative to try to rebuild trust. There are technological solutions. Facebook could prioritize on the news feed links that people actually read. So it turns out fake news travels more quickly than real news because people share inflammatory headlines without reading them. And Facebook creepily can tell whether we've read a post, and they could choose. And in fact, the new Stanford project led by Richard Pursley is proposing to put higher on the feed stuff that people read, so to promote reason rather than passion. That's a modest technological solution. Other stuff along those lines?
Well, for starters, let's just stop using the term fake news. It is a...
Can we add political correctness to that list?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get it's short and punchy and doesn't take up a lot of space in your headlines, and there are all sorts of bad reasons why we default to it, especially since the alternatives are horrible. But one of my colleagues, Claire Wardle, who's one of the world's experts in what we refer to as information disorder, refers to F*** news, will not use the term. And it's partly because it has been so distorted from, its original, we sort of understood, Macedonian teenagers who were making up stories in order to make money. It has obviously transformed significantly and come to mean any number of things, none of which are good for institutions or for trust or for journalism or for civil discourse. And among other things, it elides the important differences between misinformation, which is information that's just wrong. It's a mistake that someone made, but like an honest mistake. Malinformation, which is actually true, but intending to do harm. So revenge porn is malinformation. The leaked emails, illegally leaked emails. The emails are true, the information is true, the intention behind publicizing them is to do harm. In the middle is disinformation, not true, intending to harm. And it is that space, that disinformation space, where you see the Facebook post that tells people you can vote by text, and all of the different voter suppression efforts, all of the information that was shared that isn't true, that is meant to damage individuals or damage institutions. Those are poisons in the body politic. And so I think if we don't have the right terminology and toxicology to address them, then it's going to be very hard to come up with a solution.
So I agree with the way that she explains the difference between the terms, but the question then becomes is, does the average reader out there who's reading our news know the difference or know better? Because when the president uses that term over and over and over, it becomes part of the conversation, right? So nobody's going to care about the difference, even though you're right. So what do we do then?
Well, what we need to do on this panel is figure out how serious a problem it is. And thank you, Nancy, for malinformation, misinformation, and disinformation. If we focus on disinformation, intentional propaganda sent out by bots or by people abroad to create chaos, Kathleen Hall Jamison's book on the subject argues that it did make a difference in the election, although that's obviously contested. My question to you, Tony, as a journalist, is how serious a problem do you think disinformation is on the internet, or how would you go about measuring it?
I think disinformation, I think Nancy has it absolutely correct. You know, it is, first of all, you have a credulous electorate. And you have, all you had to do is look at 2016 and understand that something outrageous and unusual happened there. And it was probably I'm no historian, but I'm wondering if it's perhaps the first election in American history, given the fact that there were 78,000 votes that were the difference between Trump and Clinton in terms of the Electoral College victory. It's the first election that was probably significantly decided by disinformation, things that people believed that were just straight up lies that motivated them to vote in a particular way. It has had tangible impact on our country and our history. And so, so how do we deal with it? I think we have to frankly acknowledge the fact that our democracy is hackable. It is hackable by disinformation, and that we have to make a concerted effort to root out the sources of disinformation. That means that we might have to change the whole structure of you know, Facebook and our social media platforms, and maybe they need to be redesignated as utilities so that we can actually use some strong regulation to affect the way that we interact with them. Because disinformation is just going to be an intrinsic and inherent part of social platforms. So we have to be realistic in how we approach them.
So this puts the question squarely, and the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. If Facebook were regulated as a public utility and Congress said, Facebook, you must root out disinformation, that would arguably violate the First Amendment, because Congress is not supposed to tell any individual to distinguish between fact and opinion. Jefferson said that that is a distinction for citizens to make for themselves, not for the government to make. And then even if Facebook on its own decided to tell us what was true and what was disinformation, that would put huge power in the hands of young people in t-shirts and flip-flops in the Valley who are unreviewable. So, Louis, this is a really hard question, but if we posit that disinformation and malinformation are problems, how, if at all, should we expect Facebook and Google to solve it?
Wow.
Wow, indeed. And that's what Richard Gingrich is spending $300 million to figure out. So maybe we can get some of it if we can solve it on this panel.
Well, I don't know how they're going to do it. I can tell you what we've been doing as news organizations
Yeah.
in trying to root out misinformation and disinformation. And I'll give you an example of something that happened to us, last year, because I think that may sort of bring in various topics. We had, and because I think the issue of misinformation and disinformation extends beyond politics. So we had an accident, a fatal crash in one of the suburbs here in Pittsburgh. 3 women were killed. On social media, there was a video that appeared that went viral of these women prior to the fatal wreck. These women were shown on Snapchat, drinking, vodka, singing, not being completely carefree about, what they were about driving. They were they were drunk driving. They were just singing, and they didn't really sort of have any sort of filters, and everybody was sharing this video, and so when the video got into our hands, so we said, well, do we share this video with our readers? What do we do? What's our role here? And how do we determine if the video is true, right? If it's real, it could have been created by anyone, right? So we decided not to, share the video, on our site. And I often think of that situation because, I couldn't confirm if the video was accurate, if it was true, if somebody had created it, right? So the question then becomes, should we have posted that video as a news item because everybody was sharing it out there? You know what I mean? So I think we took it upon ourselves to sort of determine whether something was disinformation or misinformation, right? So I guess the question then becomes, should we have done that? So here we have the power to do that, to make that decision, right? So that's what you're suggesting, that other organizations do similar things in trying to root out misinformation, disinformation. Well, I don't think this is news. I'm not going to share it or post it for my readers, right?
But isn't that the regular gatekeeping function of all news sites? I mean, newspapers do that.
On a day-to-day basis, we do
right.
that,
I mean, that's no different. But I think that the problem here is so unique. When you have a hackable democracy, we have to come up with creative ways of dealing with it, because it is not something that's going to become, it's not like bots are going to become more egalitarian and fairer, with the next election. They will not be, more progressive, let's say, or whatever. It's just going to get worse. I mean, I think what we have, it's like, I think a good parallel would be global warming. You can sit around and sort of have an academic discussion about, the best way to affect, bring the economies and our long-term self-interest in line with a means of stopping, the fossil fuel use. Or you can wait 40 years when, the sea levels rise and so forth, and, your species is eliminated. I mean, it's a 15 alarm fire, what we have here. And I think disinformation at the heart of the democratic process is